Welcome to Out of Nowhere, where we talk with marketers, makers, and value creators about where they've been and where they're going next. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, this is Justin Watkins of Native Digital. Today we're talking TravelTech with Richard Valtr from MEWS. They've got a cloud platform that leads to better experiences for hotel guests, which leads to better revenue performance for hotels.
It started off with me. I was building a hotel in the center of Prague. I guess that was my background. So I was putting it all together. I had this whole idea of how we were actually kind of going to design the kind of the welcoming experience. So when I didn't want people standing in queues. I didn't want that to be the first thing that you actually kind of get to when you come to the hotel. And I also didn't want to have this kind of transactional relationship with the customer. That you only get to really kind of speak to them if there's a problem. So I had this idea that we could create this app that would allow somebody to kind of personalize their entire stay, check in online basically, but also kind of really say, what kind of restaurants do I like in my hometown? What kind of things would I like to maybe, what are the things that make me happy, but what are the things that I want to actually kind of experience, which is new and which is going to be unique to this place that I'm going to. And that's an obvious problem for technology to handle. So we just then kind of thought about, okay, well, so how can we create this essentially this app, and then how can we kind of then link it through, because the hotel was a 60-bed hotel. So we thought about, okay, then how do we create this kind of task management software that could carry all of that out in a distributed way, so that when you actually kind of arrived at the hotel, you had more of a kind of welcoming procedure rather than a check-in experience, basically, where you'd already started half of the conversations that you were actually going to have once you arrived at the property. And that's why the place was, it was designed like a stylized living room, not really like a reception desk. That was really the idea. And then I just thought that it would be super easy to plug this into some sort of hospitality, system in the back end. And, I'd worked with PMSs my entire life, but I never really kind of, thought that much of them. So I just thought it would be super easy to just plug into it. And, and here's Opera and Oracle, or back then it was Microsoft Fidelio. Why don't I just plug into that, because that's, and then that's the scaling models. And I was like, I'm sure pretty much like loads of kind of lifestyle hotels want to actually kind of solve this problem. So why don't I kind of, build this application for this hotel, and then we can actually kind of sell it elsewhere. And then like lots of other ideas basically around what we could do. The problem is that I started speaking to them, and I just realized actually, like, there's nothing to plug into. There's no logic that actually enables a system like this. There's no logic in the PMS itself that thinks guest first. It thinks room first. So there was no way for us to basically kind of have a a guest profile without creating something weird like a room profile, which is essentially what you have in every other PMS. And it was things like that, the disjointed nature, how there was no way to really properly think about payments. And if you think about it, payments and authentication are the main thing that you're actually kind of doing during a check-in process. And that just was completely out of the scope and the thought of how the APIs were designed. So all of that just seemed that it was completely in the wrong direction for where this industry I thought was going to kind of go. So that's when we kind of pivoted, flipped, and we thought, well, why don't we actually kind of create this mesh of how future hotels are actually going to kind of run? And 10 years later, I'm still here doing it. But
So it sounds, what I'm picking up on is there were some things that, again, out of naivety, which is how it always goes, is like, oh, that'll probably be easy. So you definitely found like where the difficulty was. Where were some of the like initial ideas where you're like, that's definitely right? Like was it the need that you perceived, was that on? It was just like how you're going to get there is going to be a lot of integration issues, or where were you off? Where were you on?
I think that basically like the main way that I thought about this, or this kind of problem, is like, what are hotels, and like what is fundamental? So having a check it, like I always hated, like my parents basically, or especially my mother, had kind of like always built up basically this like she kind of started off by bringing investors into kind of Czechoslovakia basically after the war, and then slowly over time she kind of built up her own kind of portfolio and things like that. And so that's where the kind of the entrepreneurial gene kind of comes from. And so but the problem was, is basically like, when I was 15, 16, I'd always have to work as a night receptionist basically, or a night auditor in one or two of these kind of smaller hotels. And so that's really where my hatred for the reception desk kind of came from, because I hated just being behind the desk. Yeah, because to me it's like you're just a shopkeeper. Yeah, you're there basically to take orders and to kind of give out services, but that's not what hospitality is. Like Airbnb is a lot closer to what hospitality is than a modern hotel. And so for me, it's just the only two differences are basically like, you can do that when you're welcoming a friend, or basically somebody who you kind of in a social network with, like essentially what Airbnb is. But it's different when you're trying to do those types of things at scale. But the thing is, most people who travel, they yearn for that kind of connection. Yeah, they want to kind of they want to ask some of those questions. Basically, they just feel like fools when they have to actually kind of ask, like, where is this place, where is this place? Because especially now with like having Google Maps and stuff like that, like you should know all of those things. But I think that desire to actually just connect with people, yeah, and the desire for others to actually kind of be welcoming and actually kind of let them actually kind of welcome somebody into their home or into the establishment where they work. I think that's pretty natural for people, and that's actually quite a kind of generalized human skill. And so for me, like the part that's inhumane about hospitality is all the admin. And so I don't think anyone really kind of comes into hospitality going like, oh, this is great, I'm going to be like looking at an enlarged Excel table for 12 hours of my life. Yeah, and same thing is like I don't think anyone comes to a location and goes, oh great, I'm now going to be like standing for like 10 minutes in this queue waiting for somebody to basically kind of scan my credit card. Yeah, like, and those, so I think that I just look at it from a philosophical kind of point of view, that the more closer you are to the truth of what the exchange actually kind of is, the better product you're actually going to create.
What you're saying about being, are you room centric or are you customer centric? It's lip service to say we're customer centric and that's what matters the most, but then you get into your systems and your systems don't even let you be that. You're fighting against that, right? And so it's also interesting what you're talking about with Airbnb, because I agree with you, right? It's kind of going back to the way it used to be in some ways, but they found a way to do it at scale. Is it fair to say that, I think it sounds like what I'm hearing is MEWS is trying to get us back to the way hospitality should be. In some ways, it's actually probably going to get you closer to the way Airbnb is right now. Although I'm not sure you're making those comparisons in your conversations or not, but is that?
Like, I think that Airbnb is a good, like, it's basically a good brand for the type of experience. Basically, it's a social network. Like, they've figured out basically how to have a brand as a social network. Yeah, and I think that's really, really nice. And all of their design, all of their kind of, I guess, basically targeting choices and things like that. I'm not sure if it kind of works for every single person. I don't think that's like, it's definitely a player in hospitality. I think the way that we see ourselves is basically, we'd like to have Airbnb as a customer somewhere down the line, because the idea of what we're trying to kind of build is, this idea that we can create that mesh and everyone can basically like create whatever is basically on top of that. So if you're a brand that wants to kind of go, super functional, so let's say like Uber, is basically like a super functional kind of, transaction service, basically connecting, a commuter to a car. Yeah. And it's basically like, do you have spare capacity to actually take me from A to B? Yeah, it's great. Like, I know that they have like limos and whatever, but fundamentally that service is like, do you have spare capacity in your car to take me from A to B? Yes, great. You go in, like there's no 5-star rating that's necessary for that transaction. It's basically like what is it, like you've driven me from this place to that place, like what is a 3.5-star rating for that? Like it's basically you either did it or you didn't do it. Yeah, you either did it in like an acceptable amount of time or you didn't do it. Yeah, so that's like a fairly standard transactional kind of social network for that type of service. Yeah, and then for example, like you'll have other brands which are more kind of lifestyle brands where you actually do want the kind of the softness, the human interaction, all of those things. And so there you actually want the richness of basically kind of human interaction to actually be, you know, like turned up to the max. And if somebody's kind of, you know, not giving you that, you know, the not being able to actually kind of like look that person in the eye because they're just stuck on a screen and they're kind of doing this, they're not really asking you any questions about experience, they're not helping you basically kind of answer some of those questions that you might have, they're not helping you fulfill that need that you had, which was, you know, which is then supposed to be serviced by you actually kind of being in this place, like then they're being taken away from that. Yeah, whereas and I feel like that's ultimately where all of these different brands are going to kind of, you know, like they have to ask themselves, like, what exactly are we here to do? What exactly are these experiences that we want to actually kind of provide? Are some of them super transactional where actually it's just A to B? And are some of them actually more like, you know, complex customer journeys, which basically have as the end goal, we think, like, you know, providing remarkable experiences, you know, something which sticks in the memory basically and creates that ultimate, you know, I'd say basically like, you know, value token for you, which is a true memory basically that you have that you then want to kind of go back to. It's the things that, you know, when you think about, you know, a smell evoking a certain type of holiday, basically like a piece of music, you know, reminding you of a summer that you had, like all of those things basically, that's true hospitality. Because if you're helping somebody create those memories, you're creating real value towards the rest of their lives, and that's the higher end of kind of hospitality.
Yeah, I agree with that. So just to go back, you have a 60 key hotel. You imagine a better experience, a better welcoming experience versus just a check-in desk. You wanted it to have, you saw that as a missed opportunity, and you wanted to do something about it. You felt like technology could play a role. You saw that was all built backwards, basically. So you start down that process. Can you talk a little bit about the adoption of this? So you're building this technology. Like, who are the early adopters? Who are the ones that are getting on board? What's kind of like the ideal fit for you? And what has been some of the feedback that you're hearing from them? Like, why do they continue? Why do they like it? What has it done for them?
Like, I think at first, basically, we like the first couple of properties basically that we were in, like we were a terrible PMS basically at the beginning, but it was, you know, essentially anyone who really, yeah, exactly. Like it was more about like, you know, do you really care about the guest experience? You know, is that your main kind of focus? Yeah. And then, you know, we were starting out, I sound English, but I'm Czech. So we were starting out in the middle of like, you know, I guess border of Central and Eastern Europe, you know, trying to actually kind of tell people that this is the way that they could do it. They could also do it with like, you know, maybe less staff because they didn't have to have, you know, 2 shifts of these kind of things. We also, you know, we managed to automate a huge number of different processes. We didn't have a night audit or any of that. We just basically said like, well, night audit is like, you know, one day going to the next day. Why don't we just completely automate that rather than having a process around it? All of those different things basically, like, you know, settled all my traumas that I had like being 15, but fundamentally we thought were going to be better. So it was a lot of like independent hotels, kind of boutique hotels, and then weirdly enough we found this kind of niche that really worked for the way that we thought about. So when you think about like all of these different kind of processes and building up experience from the bottom and thinking about, you know, stacking services together, that's pretty much the same way that, for example, like low cost airlines think about it, right? They think about, you know, the seat, the luggage, and so we found this like really great niche of hostels basically. yeah, that were completely underserved by the current hospitality technology. But if you think about it, it's the most pure way to look at all of these things in hospitality. And we, from a let's say a kind of philosophical background in terms of the way that we were actually kind of coding the system, we thought of all of these things basically are kind of, they'd be unbundled, and then you'd want to kind of create packages out of them, basically. So rebundle all of these services. And also is like a great example of this, because basically you have a room full of beds and nothing else, just beds. Yeah, and you're trying to cram in as many beds as you want, as you can, basically. So you got that. Then, and that's like one resource that you might have. Then you have lockers, yeah, and that's basically kind of your storage. Then you have a communal bathroom, or a shower or something like that. And every single time there's an opportunity for an upsell. So you want a private room, that's an upsell. You want a private bathroom, that's an upsell. You want basically like, a wardrobe in your room, that's an upsell as well. And so you basically then start looking at a hotel, or we thought about it basically as like the hotel rooms are fundamentally packages, they're bundles. It's just like, if you look back at the history, it's like, 1920s and bed in the bath for $1.50 and those types of slogans and stuff. But so again, they're not things that have been around for like a huge amount of time. They're essentially kind of, they've been industrialized for only the last 100 years, but it doesn't go back to the original kind of aspect, which is basically that you have all of these different resources that are being used by humans at some point of the day, and they themselves basically have different kind of prime times basically around it. Anyway, so we found, so that was from a kind of tech perspective, but we found that we found a kind of customer for that, so we could just grow through that entire niche. So when you look at like every single major hostel brand, basically, that's working with us, and that kind of gave us like enough of a growth start to then be able to kind of add in other programmers and other people basically that have now allowed us to still with that kind of like logic basically, but like cater for all different types of what we think of today as our kind of bread and butter is basically those, I guess, basically like those kind of mid-market brands, between let's say 5 and 50 hotels or something like that.
Did you experience or any sort of trends or the way the industry was going that made it more difficult, the fact that this was a trend, or were there trends that you kind of rode on and you're like, oh, everybody's looking for ancillary revenue and this is kind of, we have a solution for that? I mean, is the industry stagnant and you're just a new player in it, or are you going up against a force or going with a force?
Like, I think the problem with this industry, or the kind of the fundamentals of this industry, is that essentially like there hasn't really, because it's basically kind of real estate, there isn't really that much that you can do to change a hotel. You can reflag it, you can do a few of those kind of things, but you're not going to kind of create a better way of kind of creating better yield out of what you've already built, basically, because that's that's something there. Whereas there's different ways that the market thinks about repurposing other things, whereas hotels, they're going to basically kind of stay and operate the same way that they've been built. They can be, you can put in new wallpaper, you can put in like different things, you can somehow kind of style it differently, basically, but you're not going to knock it down and rebuild it. That's too much. So I think from that perspective, that's really the reason why, people stay with the same business models, they stay with the same things. And fundamentally, it was also, this was also the first industry to really, really get digitized. You can basically kind of point to the GDS as essentially like the first internet. And so because you actually kind of had, this kind of like codification, then you actually kind of created a lot of those things basically in the kind of 80s and 90s. They never really kind of got changed. They were always basically kind of done the same way. And it was a good enough solution for most of those different things. So that's why you didn't really kind of create that much of a, an outside force. And fundamentally, most customers, didn't really kind of want it to be different. Like, I think that, for example, like one of the interesting things is, when you, for example, like look at places where real estate is, especially kind of dense real estate, is much harder to kind of get by. Yeah, so that's, for example, like in Europe, you did have a lot of new players. So for example, like the hostel industry really boomed basically in the last 20 years, because there were a lot of people that basically realized like all we want is a cool bar, but fundamentally we don't care if we're staying in a bed. Whereas in the US, because of regulation, but also basically because of there just being kind of more plentiful space, it never really there wasn't a crunch basically to actually kind of go towards this. So fundamentally, American consumers, they still find it strange basically to find all of these Europeans that go and basically kind of like stay in hostels and things like that, because there's no kind of need for it in America. So when they're traveling around America, basically they're always staying in their kind of private rooms. And I think that maybe like that's the niche that kind of Airbnb filled a little bit more in America basically, whereas in Europe, that kind of Airbnb experience, like it didn't really feel that kind of it was just a better UX basically, and it unified a lot of these things. But people were already kind of really into alternative accommodations basically before it kind of came with Airbnb. Whereas Airbnb was a much bigger deal basically, I think, here in the US, and it just in Europe, I think it was more of a consolidation basically from a marketing standpoint, and a kind of user kind of repeatability kind of standpoint.
If I was to stay at a indie hotel and they were using MEWS, what would my experience? How would my experience be different or not different?
So I think that the first place that you'd come into contact with us is that we'll invite you into a generalized. So one of the things was that once we started doing other hotels apart from just boutique hotels, you started really kind of thinking about, okay, well, we've got to go to the universals. Yeah, we can't just basically kind of build this super luxury kind of experience, because there's in a lot of these places basically there's not going to be anyone to actually kind of do it. So we just thought, okay, let's simplify this back to the kind of bare bones. So everyone needs to do a check-in. Yeah, everyone needs to kind of like actually kind of check in from that perspective. So the first instance of you kind of interacting with MEWS is prior to actually arriving to the hotel. We first rolled this out in like 2015. You'd basically get invited to an online check-in. You'd basically load up all of your details that would be configured to whichever country that you were actually kind of staying in, and you'd be able to actually kind of check in prior to actually kind of arriving at the hotel. And so if you basically did that online check-in, you'd just walk straight through, and there'd be somebody who'd basically give you your keys, and that would be the only mandatory conversation. So you can have a much better conversation basically about whatever else that you want to actually kind of talk about. So the idea is basically about giving back that 15-minute period to the true interaction between somebody going like, here's your key, welcome to this place basically, how can I actually make this better for you? So you should see a lot more, I guess, kind of tech enablement, but you should also kind of see a hell of a lot more of that kind of human contact. And then this is, for example, like where I think that one of the most exciting things that we were able to kind of do. So again, we knew that we weren't going to be able to do every single thing under the sun. We just saw that there was a huge amount of kind of newer startups and new ideas. So we opened up our API completely and fully, back in like 2015 or whatever. And there were all these kind of like startups that were basically doing the same thing as us, like trying to connect into the kind of the big boys of the industry, who'd always looked at it as basically a revenue generating instance. And so they just basically thought like, so we were essentially the first hotels that they could actually kind of grow through. So that was incredibly exciting for them basically. So all of those things basically just started really kind of coming in together. So your experience as a guest could then be basically kind of from a tech perspective, a lot of hotels. So for example, like if you want to plug in a platform for tours and experience. Yeah, if you want to plug in a platform basically which kind of, you know, gives you better itineraries basically of your stay. You know, if you want to plug in another platform for, you know, smart upselling or something like that, you know, better revenue management, all of those things, you can now do that with MEWS. And so like, I'm super proud to say basically how many, you know, and point to how many different startups, you know, got their first 100,000 customers basically, you know, just because of the fact that we just made it so unbelievably easy for them to scale.
I think I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I'll ask anyway. So you know, the guest has friction reduced by using this platform, right? Which frees up the hotel to make the welcoming experience whatever they want it to be. It can be fast and easy, or they can be creative with it. At the same time, you have an API where people are tapping into it, and you're helping solve one of the problems that you guys had originally. My question is, where are you seeing more creativity right now? Is it with the hotels, with the way they have evolved their welcoming experience, or is it more with the developers who are like, oh, we can now build using this API on this platform?
So I feel like that's basically where we'd like to kind of get to. So, you know, ideally we'd love to kind of, you know, be able to talk to all of the designers, the architects, you know, like, because fundamentally, like, you know, if you speak to most architects in the world, they're going to put a server room into the building, you know, and they'll put it right next to the reception, yeah, or whatever they basically kind of like have as a reception, and they'll put a reception desk in, yeah. And those types of things are really difficult to actually, because like the problem is basically that once you do that, you also kind of build in, for example, like the fire the fire system basically kind of like into that reception desk, because, you know, if there's a fire going on, and the problem is like you start building in all of these different dependencies and things like that, that comes from this like outdated notion that you need a server room, yeah, that all of these things basically are connected to like, you know, bricks and mortar basically, and you need to have, whereas you want the creativity of just looking at the space, yeah, and just going like, what is the best way that I can actually kind of design this entire flow using all the available, you know, square meters that I have, yeah, to actually just make it all about the guest, yeah, all about, for example, like, you know, focusing on the experience, the service, you know, also don't provide places for the staff to hide, yeah,
Right.
because like, because otherwise if you put a desk in, basically they'll stand behind the desk, yeah. If you put a like an office basically where they'll go into the office, because fundamentally people are just, they don't want to basically kind of look normal. Yeah, the way that like the modern hotel industry also kind of works is that, you know, you basically like, you've either got to do it like, you know, either it's kind of like weird and slovenly, yeah, basically where somebody's just like sitting like this behind a desk, yeah, or they're just like unbearably rigid, yeah, just standing to attention, like trying to be like a 19th century concierge, yeah. And you just like, neither of those two things are actually things that you want. So what you want is basically you come in, you know, somebody greets you, yeah, and if that person, if for example, like the way that we thought about it was like, why not have a hotel where instead of having check-in at 3 p.m, yeah, they would basically space their time out and have 15-minute slots of welcoming, like treat it like a play, yeah, like a theater performance, and every single 15 minutes somebody gets that performance, yeah, and you can have it as 15 minutes, and because that is fundamentally what you're doing, you know, with experience is basically entertainment, yeah, it sticks, you know, and I don't care if it's business, I don't care if it's leisure, it's all entertainment, yeah. And the point about it is that like, you know, nobody switches on a TV and wants to like look at like 15 minutes of like stilted kind of somebody just like parroting away something, you know, they want action, they want thrust, they want meaning, you know. And I feel like that it's the same way. And when you think about it from that perspective, basically, I think that's why, you know, that whole boutique, you know, thing came about, because people wanted to come somewhere and be entertained and kind of be, you know, have an experience, you know, be able to actually kind of memorize the people that were talking to them and all of these kind of things. And so anyway, so my point is basically it comes from the space. If you're able to be a real designer about the space, and not working with these types of these essentially kind of self-imposed barriers that you then kind of create. And you're also designing from a perspective of like, how can I maximize the experience there. What's great about it is basically somebody's always going to then have to actually kind of put in some kind of cloud system, without a server room, without a desk, to actually, and you can think about it basically whichever way you kind of want, but fundamentally it just, it enables you to design in a way that's kind of free. It's like my other kind of favorite example is like, somebody always kind of asks us like, what kind of lock is the best kind of door lock that you should have in a hotel? And I look at it as like, the best kind of lock in a hotel is zero locks. Because that's going to like, that's basically kind of like a transferable trust. And if you're able to basically say to someone, I trust you, then that is the most hospitable thing that you can do. So if you don't have to have, like, I know like you want to kind of like be able to at least lock it from inside, all of these kind of like different things, but fundamentally the best lock is zero locks. And the best way to actually kind of design that experience, basically make it as welcoming as possible. And like my point is basically is that like this is where I think like true creativity comes from. Is when you actually like, I know creativity with like, with barriers or with kind of things like always brings out the best. Like, yes, I agree with that. But fundamentally, if you want to kind of do it towards experience, towards those types of things, like you should be thinking about it basically in that way. So that's why I think that, developers have a part to play, operators have a part to play, technologists have that part to play as well.
It comes from asking the question why, right? So when you're asked, hey, what's the best lock? Well, why are they asking this? And why are we talking about locks? And how does this, what's the most important thing right now? Are we in business to provide security, to be the most secure thing, or are we in business to provide the best experience? Now, sometimes the ideal is not realistic, but you gotta ask those questions and see how close can we get to the ideal and still be realistic. But your example of the check-in desk, I'm smiling because we moved into a new office space last year, and in the process, we're building this out. It was a new build, and there were questions like, "Where's the server closet?" Well, we don't need one. Well, where's reception at? We're not going to do reception desk. Well, who answers your phones? Well, people don't really call us. It's more calls come to mobile. It's mostly email. Well, where do people wait? Well, we don't really want people to wait. And so they're just really thrown off. They're like, well, what do you want in your office space? We're like, great conference rooms, nice breakouts, and a good place to, have meals together as a team, things like that. So, like, well, that's going to be easy. I'm like, I actually think that's really hard, and let's
really hard.
Let's really think about that. But it's just, I don't know if it's not a generational thing, but things are changing, and people are used to different experiences now. If you look at like, even fast food industry, I mean, there are people who are walking in, and we've all been accustomed to walking up to the person behind the cash register, but there's a new group that's very comfortable with the kiosk, and the kiosk is an interface that they're very comfortable with, but actually they probably prefer their phone because their phone knows who they are, and so they know what their order history is. So just the way we engage and the way we interface with either people or machines, it's all changing pretty quickly. And we're learning, some people are learning new habits, some are clinging to the old ones. But it's just interesting to see how we go through that transition, right?
Yeah. And I think like that, because it's one of those kind of, because I really, really like that example that you have, because fundamentally, I think this functions as a really, really good, it's our first kind of example of what life with a data wallet actually kind of looks like, and it's basically like, this has my personalized preferences. And so all I kind of want to do is just tap it somewhere basically, or just, click a thing basically. So I share the right amount of information about myself basically, where I'll share it if I get some kind of personalized service in return for it, and that, I think in that way, like, when people talk about Web3 and stuff like that, like, yes, like metaverse, all of that weird stuff, which, but the actual kind of idea of it basically is that like you have something and you go, this is my data wallet, I'll share it with you. If I know what that transaction is basically kind of going to be like, I might actually give you loads of more information, yeah, if I feel that it actually kind of gives me more and better services basically. And I'll let you keep that information and do all of it, but you've got to kind of make sure that that you know who the ultimate owner of it is basically, yeah, and B, like you won't use it for nefarious purposes, but you'll fundamentally only use it to actually drive really, really good outcomes basically for me. So I feel like that's the next version of all of these things basically, when we're not just looking at we're looking at it basically in a much better segmented way, where it's not just here is one flow, but it's basically those those 15-minute welcoming things are all about individualized welcoming procedures and kind of personalized plays.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're learning new habits, we're learning new interfaces, and standards are being set in different industries that we transfer over to the next industry, right? So the way we interact with a grocery store, a restaurant, or bank sort of sets the stage for what we think, how good it could be or how bad it actually is. And so hospitality can either get ahead or they can be drug along. And but like you said, there's an opportunity there for what can we use technology in a way where it doesn't reduce the thing we're here to do, but actually potentially enhances. And everybody has different preferences. Some people want to just come and go, but I think to your point, you have a platform where a brand gets to decide what they want their branded experience to be like, probably attracting the customers who typically want that branded experience for the most part. And now have maybe some new opportunities for creativity to rethink, like how do we make our first impression? What's the stay look like? That type of thing. In a world where maybe that hasn't changed a lot in a long time, right? Like just structurally things were in place where it just needs to be good. And
and basically it was like, essentially it was just like the creativity and the personalization, only the upper echelons can basically kind of have it. Yeah. Whereas I feel like now with like, when you think about like 3D printing, when you think about us getting, slightly better at kind of, energy transformation and things like that, you start going like, well, it can actually become a mass market product basically to kind of have personalized products and things like that. And you can see that in like things like fast fashion and things like that, which are awful, but technologically it's kind of going in the right kind of direction. And so when you kind of like start seeing it from that perspective, you start going like, this is great. This is exactly like, letting you live a kind of luxurious lifestyle basically, that's at your fingertips. Yeah. And the brand then basically kind of, rather than going back to that mean basically, which is like a fairly bland vanilla, nobody's going to kind of get offended basically by this type of furniture. You're actually going like, no, either let's basically kind of only focus on the right type of customer that we think that we can actually kind of like really, really get the most out of, because that's how we build loyalty. Or they get really, really intentional also on just being able to be super flexible. And then, the added thing to it basically is when you start thinking about that, being relevant to that person throughout their entire kind of life. So you really start thinking about, not just the transactional, 2-3 day stay, but you start looking at it as basically, how can I be relevant to this person for more than, let's say 10 days out of the 365, and there, like that, I think becomes a really, really interesting kind of challenge and interesting idea.
Absolutely does. So where are you and the team looking at next? Where, if you look down the road, what are you guys pushing towards? What do you hope to be? Any thoughts on that?
Like, I don't really like, I think that, overall, basically, like we're trying to, I think like one really, really important aspect basically that we kind of always talk about is basically that we think that this is one of the most creative industries in the world. and we just want to see more of that creativity. Yeah, so we kind of like, we always used to get back when events basically were a thing, and thankfully, like, I think they're coming back. We always used to be quite famous for like having these like outlandish things, basically at these like stodgy hotel conferences. So for example, like we'd put like a massive like greenhouse, yeah, and then all of us dressed as basically kind of like in these overalls as farmers, basically would be like carrying around shovels and things like that. And the idea was basically that we were like a topsoil, yeah, and then you'd basically go to like, and we would invite all of our kind of tech partners, and they'd be basically sitting in these kind of like in these flower patches. And the idea was basically is that like we're the topsoil, yeah, and you just like put your seeds basically, and you let them grow, yeah, and in that way, it's like you don't. It's like, for example, like as an architect, like, or a designer, you don't exactly know how it's going to kind of, how it's going to work in the real life, or even as a parent, basically, yeah, like you don't know exactly how that child is going to kind of go, but you might just prune, you might, but it's very, very difficult to basically kind of, and I think that's how you should be thinking about, the creativity of experience creation. Yeah, it should basically kind of come from this idea that you're just creating the right environment, and then you're pruning, you're using fertilizer, all of these kind of like different things, but it's in aid of like making these beautiful flowers and these beautiful kind of things. So anyway, so like it's very kind of high-minded and stuff, but that's what we really, really want to kind of concentrate on. Those are the types of outcomes that we really kind of want. And again, basically, like there's nothing wrong with just, like creating cabbages, because it's a staple food, yeah, or like potatoes, basically. Yeah, it's like, but it's the same thing. Like you want to be able to actually kind of create that richness of the environment, to actually kind of be able to create all of those different types of experiences. Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about. There's something very fulfilling from creating something and setting a goal and creating something bigger. There's something that's uniquely fulfilling whenever you build something and you get to see someone build something else on top of it that you never imagined.
Exactly.
And we've done that ourselves a few times. It's very, I mean, in our world, that's not a common thing. But whenever you stop moving on something, and then someone maybe you don't even know picks it and takes it and runs with it, does something that also you would have never dreamed of, it's wildly fulfilling. I mean, it's just cool to see.
Yeah, like it's one of the things where basically like we wish there were, for example, like more developers, like software developers in our space. Like we wish that we could actually kind of like somehow have more intellectual heft, exploring different business models, different ideas. Why isn't there a software, like basically like something which just thinks in terms of like, why isn't there a Netflix for travel? Why hasn't somebody tried that, basically? Why isn't there something else, basically, where you can think of different models? You see it now with, for example, like buy now pay later and things like that, and that's like different ways that you can work around with credit. But like, for example, like one of my favorite brands that we actually have is these guys called the Student Hotels, and they're actually kind of massive in Europe. And the way that they think about like their inventory is like we're super aligned basically around these things, because they think about it kind of from a seasonal perspective, but then they also kind of look at like their weekdays and weekends basically as different inventory. So their inventory and the way that they've built it is super flexible, basically. But they also then think about it, so it's basically dorms during the week, hostel beds basically during the weekend. Yeah, then they turn half of the rooms basically into kind of like hotel rooms during during the time when the students are basically all kind of out. Yeah, then they have like long-term spaces as well, basically, for like people who want to kind of come and travel there, and who are so you then start thinking about like all the different business models that they're housing. So they've got like a subscription product for maybe 3 years. They've got a subscription for product for maybe 2 trimesters or something like that. They've got a subscription product for something else. They also have one which is, transactional for like 1-2 night stays. They then basically have, and then this is what's great is that, they've started seeing, okay, we had this, we thought that it was mainly for these students, but then there's all these people that basically want to come back and stay because they really, really liked being in that kind of milieu. So they started kind of like building in more long-term units. Then, for example, like they started, and then that kind of like morphed into co-living, where you'd have like 25-year-olds, 26-year-olds. Then they basically kind of started experimenting with having, for example, like certain types of, offices and things like that, where now they're really kind of actually breaking out into building huge amounts of co-working spaces, basically. Because what they're finding is people are kind of graduating or near to graduating, and like all these other companies, basically like the booking.coms, the Nikes, whatever, they want to actually kind of like find places for where, for example, interns can work and things like that. And because these are the same people, and the same kind of crowd, it's just a great way to actually kind of, have these people actually kind of do these things if they're just out of university or just before it. And again, basically, like, then you start thinking about it even more deeply, and you start going, okay, well, look, how much should we be offering these rooms to these people when they're, age 19, because they're, for example, doing a computer science degree. So we can probably extrapolate what their next 10 years of earnings are going to actually look like if they actually kind of like, do their degree. Therefore, why don't we start incentivizing people with like cheaper rents, basically, who are doing CS degrees, to actually kind of like live in the thing. If there's some way that we can kind of incentivize them to actually have a 10-year association with us, basically. So what I mean is, like, that to me, that's the type of creativity that we really, really want to see with all of these different brands and all of these, so, and again, it kind of comes first with like, these are the customers that I have, these are the things that I kind of want. And then you start thinking about, how do I grow it? How do I do all of these things? Like, they just raised, I think, something like $500,000 like euros, like a couple of months ago, basically to go and actually kind of, have more than like 20 other units. And that's the kind of thing, like Lifehouse, for example, here in the US, they started off, they've raised something like 100 million or something like that, basically, like, again, just growing from these types of things. And that's ultimately, I think, where we kind of want to see ourselves, basically, is like, providing those types of services to those types of like real, maybe you didn't start out with a real innovative edge, but we will push you there, basically, because you could just, we will make you be creative.
That's cool. Well, up to this point, what's been the most rewarding part of this adventure you're on?
Being able to pay people.
That's a good one.
No, I feel like that's like I think what's nice about it all is, when you start a company and it is basically a series of like unconnected weird ideas, and then you see that it's doing well, and then you see that it's actually kind of like making money, and then you see that people want to make more, like put more money basically into it to help you, expand your stupid ideas, basically, and then there's others who kind of, who actually believe in it, start thinking like, this is actually a great place for me to like have the next like 2-3 years of my life, and I think that, like, from that perspective, I'm incredibly lucky to be surrounded by like extremely intelligent people who somehow think that this is worthy of a section of their life, basically. And like that for me is like just super rewarding, basically.